Board of Directors for the Carson Home and Museum. I want to welcome you all this evening. This is the final lecture in our series, our summer series, and of course we were so concerned about the weather and we needed some additional tech support for this evening's lecture that we wanted to find a different venue, and I thank the Harwood for working with us to allow this to happen this evening. Of course, the weather is absolutely perfect outside. I hope you enjoy it after the lecture. I also want to mention these lectures. This summer lecture series was sponsored by a grant from the New Mexico Humanities Council. We're very fortunate to work with them on the summer lectures. This lecture should run about 50 minutes with time for questions afterwards. So one last thing, I would ask that you turn off your cell phones, and I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Virginia Scharff is Associate Provost for Faculty Development and Distinguished Professor of History and Director of the Center for the Southwest at the University of New Mexico. She has published numerous books, including Taking the Wheel, Women and the Coming of the Motor Age, 20,000 Roads, Women, Movement, and the West, 2 textbooks, Present Tense, the United States since 1945, and Coming of Age, America in the 20th Century, Homelands, How Women Made the West, and the edited volume, Seeing Nature Through Gender. She was Beneke Research Fellow in the Lamar Center for Frontiers and Borders at Yale University 2008 and 9, and is Chair of Western Women's History at the Autry National Center in Los Angeles. Also a Fellow and Executive Board Member of the Society of American Historians. She was President of the Western History Association for 2008. Professor Scharff's most recent book, The Women Jefferson Loved, was named a New York Times Editor's Choice. In this book, Scharff puts Jefferson's free and slave families into the same story and reveals how Jefferson's love for women shaped his ideas, achievements, and legacies. For the first time, Dr. Scharff gives us a Jefferson who belongs to all of us. Professor Scharff served as co-curator of Homelands, How Women Made the West, an exhibition sponsored by the Autry National Center, which opened in Los Angeles at the Autry in April 2010 and traveled to the Missouri History Center, the Museum of New Mexico, and the Gilcrease Museum. She's also the author of 4 mystery suspense novels written under the name of Virginia Swift: Brown-Eyed Girl, Bad Company, Bye Bye Love, and Hello Stranger. She is at work on an exhibition and book about the Civil War in the West. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Virginia Scharff.
All right, we're going to take the lights down a little bit, and I want to say thank you very much to all of you for being here. You can see well enough there. Is that good? Otherwise, it would be very, very intimate in here, I'm afraid. But thank you, Martin. And I want to also thank Karen Douglas. I want to thank the Kit Carson Home and Museum, the Harwood. Thank you, Susan Long, Henry. Thank you, Amy Rankin, for the logistical support. Everybody worked really hard to bring me up here and to support this event, and I am really grateful to be here in Taos. I always love any excuse to come up here. I am, as must have been abundantly clear from the introduction, in which gave you my life in very exhaustive detail, or maybe exhausting detail, I'm a historian of women, and I'm also a historian of the American West. And for about 20 years or more now, I've been working to put those 2 subjects together. But in fact, that's turned out sometimes to be a little bit harder task than I'd imagined, because it seems that the central, the invisibility of women in Western history is pretty conspicuous. In fact, with only maybe a couple of conspicuous exceptions, and I might mention here somebody like Georgia O'Keeffe. I guess in Taos you know about Mabel Dodge, you know about some of the other women in your history, but for the most part, the history of women in the American West is it's a little bit like the history of air. You know, you could write Western history without women in it. You just couldn't have Western history without women in it. So in the next hour or so, let's just all agree that if you want to know something about the Western past, you ought to know something about women's history and about women's role in that past. But in order to do that, we have to kind of dig our way out of some pretty deeply engraved narrative tracks in the history of the American West. So you all know what the familiar epic of Western history looks like. It begins with the coming of European and Euro-American men to the West, guys like, Kit Carson, for that matter. And this is a history that has mostly relegated women to walk-on parts when it hasn't entirely written women out entirely. So I guess sometimes it seems to me as if Western history were a series of snapshots of epic figures that, in my view, have gotten a little bit exhausted. Maybe like this guy. The dust-creased cowpoke, staking out his horse and throwing his saddle on the ground and laying his weary body down after riding the range for a long, dry, dusty day. So I want you to try to imagine something with me. Now, this cowboy is obviously very, very tired. And he thinks he has staked out his horse and laid down his head and made his very rudimentary camp in what he thinks is the middle of nowhere. But when he wakes up, he sees this. So the place he thought was the middle of nowhere reminds him that it's something else. He hears a high-pitched squeal, and it's a ground squirrel that's been surprised into somebody's snare. He hears a young girl laugh, and he looks around, and to his very bashful embarrassment, he realizes he's in the middle of somebody's garden. He's surrounded by women digging roots and plucking berries and putting them in baskets and talking to each other and laughing as they work. What he might not realize is that women like the ones around him have been gathering on this ground not simply since early in the morning, but for mornings stretching back not simply hundreds but thousands of years. And the baskets that they're holding and that hold the proceeds of their day's work are themselves the products of the efforts of those women, and they are quite simply the basic means that the people that they've made a home for have to carry more than their hands can hold. They hold the ingredients for a day's meal. They are even the means by which you cook that meal, although how many of you have ever tried to cook a meal in a basket? The combination of baskets and fire are a little tricky. Require a pretty skilled chef, and you can imagine that for hundreds and even thousands of years, doing that kind of work means amassing a tremendous amount of cultural knowledge and skill. Now, of course, these baskets do store any extra food they might manage to gather or trap on a really good day. So I want you to imagine this scene with me, the scene of this garden place, and you'll see clearly that the story of people in that place is a story not of a lone male figure in an empty landscape, but instead it's a tale of an uncountable number of people, including women, doing pretty boring, mundane things. And these are stories that stretch back hundreds, thousands of years, and they are the stories of creating and claiming home places. So the West was a home before it was anybody's West, a lot of people's homes before it was anybody's West. Now, over the years, I've been involved with a lot of different kinds of history projects, and I've been involved with television productions and Chautauqua tent shows, and you could just name it, I've done it, in the name of taking history out to people. But recently, as Martin mentioned, I've been working as Women of the West Chair at the Autry National Center in Los Angeles, and in partnership with the Western Women's History curator out there, Carolyn Brucken, I was lucky enough to curate an exhibition and work on a book titled Homelands: How Women Made the West. And in this exhibit, we asked visitors to think of the West as many people's homes over thousands of years and as a site of ongoing encounters among people whose actions are shaped by our ideas about how we live and where we live and the houses we dwell in, how our families work, how we use our land and our resources. And often, in the process of claiming these places, we are clashing with and contesting with and contending with other people who also claim these places at home. I understand that here in Taos, there have been some discussion about what the name of your wonderful park ought to be, and I think that is really emblematic of those kinds of contests over whose home is this, who names it, who claims it, who inhabits it, and on what terms. And I've been lucky enough to enter into that conversation from this particular angle. I start with women and home rather than the familiar departure points of exploration and frontier. So I think the history that I've come to see as the one most familiar to me is somewhat unfamiliar to most people. Now, when I talk about home, I'm not just talking about a house. I'm talking about physical spaces that range from camps and gathering grounds to dwellings and neighborhoods, fields and pastures, streets and towns and cities. And home, to me, also encompasses the kind of territories that we carry around in our heads, what some historians have called mental territories. And that includes all the cultural values and assumptions we bring to claiming some place as our home. I like to think about the kind of environmental factors that shape human habitation. And, we also want to think about the people who are moving in and out of the spaces that we're claiming and reinventing again and again. Now, we know that homes can be places of possibility and also places of limitation and confinement. So when I first started working on this project, we had lots of different people coming through the Autry Museum and critiquing and commenting on this thing. Everybody from our own children, who we put in front of the storyboard for our exhibition, to some of the most eminent historians in the Los Angeles region. We had docents, we had graduate students, we had members of the general public, and some people were really uncomfortable with the idea that we were going to approach women's history through this concept of home, because they said, hey, women have been trying to escape from the home forever. Why are you doing this? And we said, well, we figure if the theme of home has been so important in women's lives, we want to run right at it. We want to understand it. We're not going to run from the thing that seems most obvious. We're going straight into the heart of it. Now, I know that women's historians have reason to be suspicious of confining women to the home. And after all, we get paid to do things that are outside the home if you're a college professor like me preaching and teaching about women's history. But I do insist that claiming a home is a potent way of transforming the world. Instead of worrying that I'm trivializing women's history by looking at this association with the home, I've tried to expand that definition to encompass this whole process of inhabiting places. And so I would say that in the name of home, women have done everything from the kind of gathering you just looked at, to building houses, to speculating in real estate, to running governments. So let me return to my first argument. Places we now identify with the West have longer and deeper identities as homes. And there's certainly been plenty of fighting over the history of the West. In fact, as you know, here in Taos, those fights go on to this day. And so it's not just about people like me flinging ink around fighting with each other, but really, this is the kind of disagreement that can really cause a lot of conflict within communities. it can cause the kind of conflict on a larger scale that results in pretty vicious outbreaks of violence and more wars of raid and trade and conquest than we can really count. And all of those things are conflicts over who has the right to call certain places home. In fact, of course, contests over home have been so powerful in the making of the West that the kind of conventional stories of Western history rest very heavily on both the kind of inscribing and branding of places as somebody's home and the erasing of those places as somebody else's home. If you think of the song, "Oh, Give Me a Home Where the Buffalo Roam," you're going to see a little bit about what we're talking about. The West has been created both in tension and in tandem with the making and defending and reclaiming of home places. So, two related points. First, if we imagine Western history from the standpoint of home, we get new ways of seeing a fascinating and often troubling place. And we get new ways of understanding the desires and the actions and the consequences that have made us who we are as people who live in these places. And the second contention is that thinking of the West as home will reveal the centrality of women's history to the history of the American West. So, home, despite appearances of permanence, is a tenuous and hard-won thing. And I want you, who knows what this is? That's Chaco Canyon. If you go to Chaco right now, does it look like this? No, it doesn't. It looked like this. This is a rendering what Chaco would have looked like around 1100 AD, sometime between 900 and 1100 AD. This is at the peak of development at Pueblo Bonito. And this was, we would argue, this is a pretty big home that was claimed by a large number of people. The Chacoan settlements were enormous and for quite some long time extraordinarily successful home places. They were state-of-the-art centers of civilization. My colleague Patricia Crown at the University of New Mexico, who's an anthropologist, has found evidence in Chaco Canyon of two things that you would not expect to find there. Evidence that people drank chocolate and evidence that they kept macaws as sacred animals and as pets. Now, the macaw is not native to Chaco Canyon. Neither can you grow cacao in Chaco Canyon. So this is a center of trade that reaches down into Central America. This was an extraordinarily powerful home place. And it's, of course, women who are brewing chocolate and often keeping macaws. I understand they make horrible pets. They're noisy and messy if they get out. But this, this is a place that was for a long period of time remarkably successful, but then put such a strain on available resources. It kind of grew beyond its means. So it, long before anyone expected, Chaco began to decline and people eventually had to move out of there. And places like that teach us a lot about living in the West in the here and now, I think. So if we think about women as inhabitants of Chaco and of all the other places that have been homes in the West, we begin to understand that women are people who have not only dwelled or lived in neighborhoods or villages or cities, but they also have explored and mapped the mental territories that guide us all. So think about the long history. Start maybe, you can start further back than Chaco. Start with hunting and gathering peoples. And think about the long history of women in northern New Mexico, a region formerly known as Rio Arriba, and known as many, many other things that I don't have the linguistic skills to know or pronounce before that. If we come to grips with that long history, we understand converging cultures, and we see how women have for millennia participated in that history by claiming their home in northern New Mexico through their relationship to the earth. They used what they found at hand, and one thing we know we have a lot of in New Mexico is dirt. So let's start with dirt. When we speak of dirt or of earth and of women's ways of claiming the earth, we mean everything from the landscape that has inspired the kind of great art that you have here in the Harwood, to the pottery that even in the kind of potsherds that we see in some of the archaeological sites we have here, that has, marked the history of a long time of home claiming, to adobe houses that have become the symbol of our land of enchantment, to the buying and selling of real estate that, as the historian Patty Limerick assures us, is really at the heart of the story of the American West. And you'll see today some familiar images, but I want you to think about them in a little bit new way. So to that end, what I'm going to do is let the pictures do a lot of the talking. And of course, if we're going to talk about how women have depicted their relationship to the earth, or talk about women's history in the West, and I spoke of, prominent exceptions, people who maybe have popped to the level of visibility, of course, inevitably, there is who? George O'Keeffe, right? So here's a painting from 1930, 1931 of the old Santa Fe, it's titled Old Santa Fe Road. And of course, we're going to begin here with the land itself. And I think, arguably, you've had some pretty good painters up here in Taos and in this region. And we can all argue about who's our favorite or who's the best of them. I've been looking at a lot of Bea Mandelman's paintings lately, and I confess to a real strong partiality for her. But I think if you were to ask anybody in the United States about, who's painted in the West, it would be Georgia O'Keeffe. So I wonder if I've just turned something off that needed to be on. All right. Now, what George O'Keeffe said about this painting was, "A red hill doesn't touch everyone's heart as it touches mine, and I suppose there's no reason why it should. The red hill is a piece of the Badlands where even the grass is gone. And these Badlands roll away outside my door, hill after hill, red hills of apparently the same sort of earth you mix with oil to make paint. You don't have associations with the hills. You might call them wasteland. I think it's our most beautiful country." Now, this is a diagram from an article by the Santa Clara critic and intellectual Rena Swenzel from a 1990 article titled Pueblo Space, Form, and Mythology. These drawings are by artist Jeremiah Iowa. And even in land this stark and majestic, it can be understood in a lot of ways. So George O'Keeffe understands it in her one way, but Puebloan people understand the land in a different way. The Pueblo world, as Rena Swenzel writes, first of all, is an altogether hallowed place where the breath of life energy flows through both the animate and inanimate realms in such a manner that even the house, kiva, and community forms breathe of that breath and are essentially alive. The myths, stories,